Yep.
All right, I think I got it. We are rolling. Hey everyone, I am joined today by Dr. Sophia Basaldua-Sun. She is an academic researcher studying some interesting aspects of communication, which I won't presume to detail. I'll let Sophia do that. How's it going? Thanks for joining me.
Good. Thank you for having me. Yeah. So do you want me to just say
you follow my lead, but you can say whatever comes to mind, whatever you want. How's everything? How's life in New York City amidst the outbreak? What's going on up there?
I do most of my research from home, so it hasn't affected me too profoundly other than just feeling confined to home rather than being here by choice.
Sure.
And yeah, I guess it affects my research a little bit, but not a lot. And I can talk about that a little bit more later.
Mm-hmm.
My husband is a doctor, and then my brother-in-law is an ER physician. So I feel like kind of always hearing about the outbreak and how intense it is out there, but not really personally experiencing it beyond just worry, I guess, for loved ones.
You know, you and your family and your husband may be a bit more in the thick of it than I am. I haven't left the house. I'm in Pittsburgh, and the illness hasn't really hit us as hard as it has other metro areas. But I had made the comment yesterday it was the day before yesterday to my wife, like, you know, this is all just very bizarre and surreal. Like, all of these things are happening outside of what I'm seeing, and I haven't actually paid attention to the news much at all. I rely on my wife to tell me what's going on out there in the world. And I hadn't seen like pictures of sick people or overcrowded hospitals, be it in the States or abroad, and it didn't feel real to me. So I'm presuming it feels much more real to you than perhaps some others because you're surrounded by it, figuratively and literally.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, I guess, because I mean, everything about life has changed in the sense that, you know, I mean, everything and nothing has changed. New York is famous for everybody orders takeout and has it delivered to their home. So in that sense, you think like, yeah, it's set up to stay home all the time. And that's easy. But then, you know, like Chinese restaurants are disappearing, for example. There's like a very famous, I don't know how old it is, but Jing Fong, it's a dim sum restaurant that's just out of business now, I think. So that's crazy. Yeah, and I mean, you can't go outside if we like try to go for walks in the park. I mean, it's impossible to social distance here, it feels like. And then I hear all the stories going on, I guess, down at the ER that my brother-in-law works in, and it sounds just like pandemonium. They don't have enough masks.
Wow.
Yeah, he's always encouraging people, just like, if you aren't in an emergency, like, stay away from the ER because you don't want to run the risk of catching it thinking that you already have it. There's just so many negative consequences to that. And like he had a patient spit at him one day, which is like crazy. That's, you know, that's basically like, that's like a death sentence if that person had actually had COVID. So it's just like, I don't envy him his job, but he's very good humored about it.
Well, I guess you have to be in a situation like that. So so you're grounded at home. Your life isn't even really disrupted that much, or your work necessarily, since you say you do it from home. Let's talk a little bit about your background and the work that you're doing. So you're a Ph.D., so you've spent some time in higher ed and in schooling and everything. Can you talk about the degrees that you have and how you found the track for you, and where you decided to go to school and what majors, etc.?
All right. Yeah. So I guess I did my bachelor's degree in English literature, and I started at a little school called Oxford of Emory, which is like a satellite school of Emory University. And then I switched to an English department. So I wanted to be a creative writer. And that's how I began. for the first 2 years. And then I left Emory because of the economic crisis and
Right.
went to a local school, Armstrong Atlantic State University. And that was a really good time to kind of rethink halfway through undergrad exactly what I wanted to major in. They had a creative writing major at Armstrong, but I was becoming more interested in literature and studying that academically. So I ended up deciding to shift to English literature. And
Mm-hmm.
then I applied to master's and PhD programs. I got into one at Clemson University, which I applied to because one of my favorite undergrad professors had gotten her master's there. So I was very pleased to get a funded master's.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So I got in there and I got into UGA, University of Georgia, but they didn't offer funding for master's students. So that was an easy choice. I went to
Mm-hmm.
Clemson for English literature. And then after, I guess you kind of start thinking about the PhD a year into a 2-year master's program. And so I started applying to PhD programs in English, and I was really planning on doing that. But my thesis advisor had gotten her degree in the comparative literature department at Stony Brook. And I really
Mm-hmm.
didn't know what comparative literature was, but I took her advice that I should apply there because she thought it was a good fit for the kind of research I was doing. I was writing about cosmopolitanism at the time, which is a much better fit for comparative literature. And so I applied, they accepted me. I also got into an English department in Florida. I always forget, is it University of Miami? I think that's the one in Florida, and then Miami University is in Ohio. So I got into the one in Florida.
Correct.
And but Stony Brook offered me a fellowship, which meant I would have a lot of protected research time. So I took that and went up to comparative literature still with a very vague idea of what the field was. And yeah, spent the next 6 years studying 3 different, I guess, language traditions, which
Mm-hmm.
were, I looked at literature from Buenos Aires, New York, and Paris. So literature in French, Spanish, and English.
Yeah. So what is comparative literature?
Oh, that's so hard. I have a blog post on my website about this, and most comparatists even don't really know how to describe it. I would say that we emerge out of a conundrum, which is that most literature study has either been studying a national tradition or now a language tradition. So you have Spanish, English,
Mm-hmm.
French, but these departments don't really communicate with each other necessarily. So comparative literature emerged out of that to be the kind of discipline where you could talk about the relationship between literature across linguistic and national barriers. But it then evolved into being kind of the seat of theory or literary methods. And so it kind of has that like dual background, and it's also spawned a lot of different fields like film studies, cultural studies, translation studies. So I think of it as kind of like just a good training ground for
Yeah.
anyone who wants to develop their knowledge of kind of literary studies.
Cool. That's actually interesting to me. And I'll have to read the blog post because I know less than anyone about it. But you used another word that I wanted to pick your brain on, and that was metropolitanism. What is that?
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, that's my research specialty.
Yeah.
So basically what I do is called urban literary studies, which is literary, kind of a larger field where literary scholars look at representations of cities in literature. So how does literature talk about urban space? And I developed this, I guess, kind of interdisciplinary approach to thinking about urban literature through the framework of the metropolis as it kind of pervades 3 fields: post-colonial, urban, and literary studies, or actually you could even broaden that to the urban humanities,
Mm-hmm.
to basically following in the footsteps of post-colonial and deep colonial scholars to think about what is the relationship between urban centers and regions, nations, and colonies. So how is the urban in decolonial terms, how is the urban always kind of constituted by colonialism in some way? So that for me is what thinking about the metropolis is thinking about that relationship between an urban space and its exterior that it relies on.
Okay. Could you give me a contemporary example of how or even just what your research is specifically with regards to that? Are you focusing on any contemporary examples, or is this more of a historical context, or?
I look at the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th century. That's a good question. And there are so many ways to answer it, of course, trying to settle on one. You know what I was
Sure.
really interested in recently is, the series Westworld, the HBO
Yes.
series. So you know how they're currently, the third season is set, well, it's kind of unclear where it's set, if it's set in the real world or if it's set in maybe future world, which could be a simulation. And so in the preview for that, right, they referred to this urban kind of world as a metropolis, which I thought was really interesting given the relationship that's already being set up between this idea of the real world, this sort of advanced urban civilization, in conflict with Westworld, which in all of its different iterations throughout season 2 basically are just different colonial situations, whether it's the settler colonialism of Westworld, the Raj world as British imperialism, or even they had a samurai world, which is less clearly or literally colonial, but is imperial in the sense that you have this kind of Western viewpoint of the urban civilization, then coming in and kind of like touring this fetishization of Japanese culture. So I think that's, one place where we can already begin to see this kind of question of an urban Western center in relation to a rural colonial world. And that is kind of what I'm interested in, versus something like urban studies will have a tendency of, or any kind of study of urbanism, even in literature, will have a tendency of staying within the inner workings of the city. And the question that I really want to ask is to get out of the city and into how the city affects or relies upon the world around it. So
interesting. Okay, so that is something that I think is very relatable in the most comprehensive sort of way. I mean, it feels gestalt to me in some respects. Like, what are the different parts that affect the whole? So I'm interested in hearing more of this. So elaborate. So all right. So looking at how the city affects what is beyond its perimeter, and the relationships contained therein. What is I would say, here's a good question for you. What are the most what is the, or one of the most profound things you learned through this pursuit, through this area of study in relation to that?
I think probably for me, the thing that was the biggest discovery was looking at decolonial studies as a field, which emerges out of Latin American research, really looking at how Latin America is different from, say, more modern colonial formations. And so one of the things that they do is they take Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems analysis and adapt it to think about how the modern world began emerging with essentially the voyages of Christopher Columbus and the emergence of that first kind of modern Western empire, even though we wouldn't normally think of the Spanish Empire as being particularly modern, but a lot of stuff starts kind of coming to fruition at that moment that then reaches its height in the 19th century. So I found that really fascinating. And I think the most interesting element of that for me is, if many urban scholars kind of date city history to the 19th century and Parisian urbanization and Osmanization, Latin Americanists really demonstrate how urban planning began or was tested in colonial Latin America. And I think that's just a completely paradigm shifting understanding of how urbanism functions and where it came from and the way that we understand it today.
Now, do you think that, so urbanism and urban planning, do you think some of the principles that were utilized in the past for building communities in this respect are continued to today? And then what does that maybe look like 10 or 20 years in the future? Is there any sort of roadmap that you can predict based on what you've researched?
That's a good question. I don't think that there's really a roadmap in the sense that there's a lot of like urban studies works that try to predict what the future is going to be. The one that stands out to me is Edward Soha's Post-Metropolis, where he theorized that the future of cities was decentralization. And basically the idea was kind of like a postmodern metropolis, so that you have I mean, it's what it sounds like. Everything is decentralized. Instead of having one centralized city, different industries are broken up into other areas, and there's no sort of coherent center, which is very definitely engaged with kind of postmodernism and that moment in history. But many people have critiqued him for his example city, LA, and like, yes, that fit kind of the idea of a postmodern city very well, but how does that really apply to the rest of the globe? And I think that's kind of an interesting question in terms of what urbanism is that it's different from place to place, and really just kind of depends on, I guess, what's most useful in that particular location and to their industries. We are living in what people call the urban age. So the UN has declared that over half the population, I think, is living in urban areas right now. But what gets defined as urban is not necessarily a city. So in the classic sense. So I guess in that sense, the prediction is that urbanization is going to continue to become a more and more prominent part of global society, regardless. Sure. Okay, so I went straight for the future. I forgot what the rest of the question was.
No, that's totally fine. I mean, we're seeing that now with most people really living on the east and west coast of the country, and I think that's especially prevalent when it comes to politics and especially voting. You get to see where the urban centers are on both coasts, and just the densities of population on those respective coasts. But seeing just the dynamics between how these large urban centers, the coast basically, are affected by the center where there's less people. And I've always found that to be an interesting relationship, because intuitively, like logically, it shouldn't work like that necessarily. And that's all by design. That's completely a constructed model, right? So that's what that reminds me of in specific. So when you think about those urban centers along the coast affecting everything else, it feels like the farther you move out, the more that there's this kind of resentment. In some respects, it's like, yeah, I'm in Kansas and I don't need someone from California basically defining these things for me. It's fascinating. And I don't know if I'm still talking about the same thing that you are, or even if it's adjacent, but nevertheless, I digress.
Yeah, well, I think it's, what you're getting into is kind of the divide between national imaginary versus urban imaginary. And
right.
I would say in the 90s especially, there was this kind of movement towards thinking that urban centers were going to be the node. So Saskia Sassen has a great book called Global Cities, which is a must read for anyone who wants to study urbanism, where she basically proposes that the new paradigm is that urban centers are the material nodes through which global capitalism is mediated. That globalization is too abstract. You know, there has to be a material location where it takes place. And so the cities she chooses are New York, Tokyo, and London. But I think what's kind of interesting about that is that then there's been this swing back towards nationalism lately. And I see that there's something similar, I think, that happened at the turn of the last century, right up until like the 1920s. There was this kind of, we're living in they didn't have the word global, so instead it was a world kind of urban age. And then with World War II, you see, and with the economic depressions that were going on around the world at the time, then you see the shift into fascism and nationalism. And I think we're seeing a very similar kind of reactionary swing, I guess, of the pendulum between the world is mediated through urban centers and kind of a cosmopolitan imaginary versus a kind of national consciousness.
Yeah, that feels very on point with kind of the present time. And you know, I feel like, you know, history's repeating itself, and I'm interested to see what, you know, even 5 years from now, what does this look like? And that's why I asked about like if there's any predictive nature to your research, because I mean, predictive or predictions rather are just that. They aren't necessarily accurate, but at least they can be informed, and it helps you prepare for something. I think in this case, like, you know, I've got a young family. I want to know what's going to happen next so I can prepare for whatever. And so I like that there's this forecasting kind of element to your deep research in this past. So switching gears a little bit. So you've gone through, you've got various different degrees. They all kind of touch on each other in one way or another. And there's a lot that you can do with them. I think my students right now, both in marketing and design, one of the common points on the Venn diagram right in the center is this aspect of storytelling, right? They are all going to be storytellers of some kind. The designers will be visual. The marketers, they'll be offering written stories, working with designers in tandem to create something new, right? With your background in English and wanting to or having a talent for writing, what do you recommend for students that are interested in telling meaningful and poignant stories? Or what would your process be? Any insights or recommendations?
Oh, that's a big one. Well, is there a way to like break that down into maybe more specific components of
Sure.
what in storytelling, I guess, are they going to be looking at?
Well, it really depends. So like graphic designers will be working in advertising agencies where they'll be creating advertisements, be they print or digital, where they're promoting a solution which implies a need. So when someone sees an ad or a solution to a problem, they imagine themselves like, oh, I need that thing now, I'm going to go buy that thing, right? With marketers, it's similar, but their conversation, they have more of a conversation. There's more of an iterative process. So, all right, I'm going to introduce myself to you, and then I'm going to bring up a specific topic, and then I'm going to elongate that and talk about the different aspects of it. So the whole storytelling cycle has multiple parts to it. So, and in fairness, like, it's all very research. So that's another layer to add into it. So it's not like they're just, you know, writing, just doing this writing just completely off the cuff. It's all very informed. So, and given your initial interest in creative writing and your English background, that's why I asked, because the last part would be, I think, is that neither groups of these students are trained writers. And in fact, I would say that most marketers aren't trained writers. It's either you're a good writer or you're not. And if you're not, you have to go figure it out. So maybe another question there is, how did you learn how to write?
Yeah.
Maybe start there.
All right. I mean, by reading, of course. I loved reading when I was a kid, and I think, there are better and worse ways to go about it. Nobody necessarily gave me a lot of guidance in terms of what to read. So if I could, I guess, give someone the best possible educational advice I would say, if you want to learn how to be a good writer, I would go pick up, I just moved right into what I would go do. I would go pick up Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast. I think he is someone who writes with so much clarity and simplicity, and he really takes the English language and I think simplicity is kind of the key there. He makes it kind of function in the best way it can with the least number of words, or without being he takes all the ruffles away, right? Like, he's a very modern writer in that sense. Just down to the essentials of writing.
So thank you for bringing that up, because this is something that I don't think a lot of my students are familiar with, and even I wasn't familiar with until I was in grad school, and that was Hemingway's 6-word story. You know it?
I actually haven't read that one.
Oh, well, all right, here, I'll recite it to you. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. And that's it. And the whole sort of philosophy behind that is, it's flash fiction. So basically, you can create multiple different stories or interpretations of said story, and it really creates, it stimulates creativity. So, from a marketing advertising perspective, in my world, what that means is this is how you condense a complicated story down to its most basic essentials. So I found some particular interest in doing that. So, with my clients, I would have them say, like, all right, let's break down your 6-word story. Nouns, adjectives, verbs. Pardon me, too much coffee. So let's list all of the nouns that are associated to your product or service that you want to communicate, or interpretations of your products or services on behalf of your stakeholders and your clients, different demographics. What are the verbs? What are the adjectives? And then from that, essentially, you make the 6-word story, which distills the soul of your company or your product or your service down to its most basic essentials. But ideally, in so doing, it also creates a very nuanced and layered sort of narrative. So, yeah.
So what that brings to mind for me is, I think it's a William Carlos Williams poem called The Red Wagon or something. It's like 3 lines, I think, and it's just a very brief and very to the point poem. But yeah, there are a lot of examples, I think, of very brief writing that one could look at to try to kind of come up with a style or a way of communicating. I think one thing that I always try to give my students when I have taught writing is a sense of, and I try to give this to my literature students as well, analyze the form that you're reading and the form that you're going to be writing in. So, for example, when students write an academic paper, obviously they have the next 4 years after taking a composition class to kind of navigate the academy. But ideally, what they would learn in the composition class as well is how to write in the real world.
Right.
It's hard to cover all the ways you could write in the real world, but I think that the most important thing is to be able to look at different genres, break them down, figure out how they function, and then be able to adapt your style to that. So I might ask my students to look at an academic article, but then also ask them to look at a magazine article. And one thing that happens a lot is that students tend to want to write in second person. So you did this, you did that. Not allowed in academic writing.
Yep.
At all. But I think where they pick it up is popular culture, because that's very common in magazines. So that tone has a certain authority to it, but that, I guess, point of view has a certain authority, but it has to be in the right genre, right? So it doesn't work to write a magazine in a magazine tone for an academic paper for your teacher. So I think that's one thing that I'm always trying to give my students, is that sense of, don't try to take the rules of one genre, even academic writing, and sort of rigidly apply them in your future profession. Like, no, my communications professor told me that one is never to use you. So I will not. So trying to stay away from that. Yeah.
Right. Well, in my classes, I like to incorporate a lot of writing for the exact reason you just said. Like, it never hurts to get more practice, even if you're a great writer, naturally or by virtue of learning it.
Well, and I want to say there is no natural good writer. In my opinion, I think it's all completely learned. But some people pick it up because, they just liked reading or were encouraged to do that. And other people maybe didn't find that genre that they enjoyed, so they don't engage with the written word as frequently.
That's such a great point. Because like from my end of the world, I'm dealing with creative people, right? Of which you are. But I've spent over a decade teaching artists. And when you spend a lot of time with especially visual artists, and you're just like, how did you even think of that? And sometimes it just comes organically. Like, there is this innate talent that most artists don't even necessarily consider, like, oh, maybe there's just something with my lived experience that, made me do this thing. Sometimes it's a happy accident and whatever, but, there is this sense of internal or innate talent. And to your point, like, with language, like, that's very functional. That's something you have to learn. It's not something you necessarily just kind of experience, which is just kind of an interesting sort of relationship. So I'm used to saying, like, oh, well, they're just kind of by default, just a naturally good writer. But to your point, like, those people are also reading a lot of books, or not just books, but they're just reading.
Yeah. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a writer, right? So I was like trying to write novels. And I remember the first time I tried to write, well, I mean, there were many first tries, right? I'm writing a novel, but the first time I really kind of did it, and then thought, okay, now I'm going to research where I should send this, and discovering, well, I have about 20,000 words. And a novel is actually about 80,000 to at the most 130,000 by general publishing standards. And that changes by genre. But this kind of realization of like, oh, now I have to figure out how to write a story that's this long. And so then I wrote another one, and it was 80,000 words, but it was definitely a stretch of kind of like, well, now I'm going to add another episode to get to my 80,000 words. And it wasn't necessarily a cohesive story or a novel in the way that you would expect today. Maybe it was more akin to like Tom Jones, just throw another episode in there and send it to the printer and make some money. And so then I think on like the third one, I finally started getting like the actual shape of a novel. But I think that it's a learning process, right? Because first you have to realize that there are these arbitrary standards, like who decided 80 to 100,000 words was what a novel was? Well, somebody. And now you have to write in that. So
focus groups. They put people in a room, made them read a book, and said, how much is too much? It's like,
when is it too expensive?
Right. Yeah. When is it too? Yeah. What's the price point? How much is the cost for production and manufacturing and all that? Yeah. It's funny how things like that, which seem arbitrary, can actually be quantified scientifically, which kind of, takes the fun out of it. you know,
But then I
especially.
think when you have those confines, it can actually make it better in some ways, because
Absolutely.
given absolute freedom, I find I don't produce much of value. But once I have limits, it's like I just kind of fill those in a way that always surprises me. So,
You know, it reminds me of a Michael Chabon. I think it was Michael Chabon book, Wonder Boys, where
mhm.
this professor in Pittsburgh, coincidentally, he just takes off all. He basically writes this gigantic book, like it's his masterpiece, and it's terrible. It's just absolutely god awful, because they took away all the limits. He just started writing it. It just kept going for like 20 years. And then some student comes along and writes something very small, but it's like so profound and of such high quality. It just, hijinks ensue, nevertheless. But okay, so I want to switch
Michael
gears
Chabon
because
actually has a really good essay collection. I forget what it's
he
called, but there's
does.
one essay
Yeah.
called Trickster in a Suit of Lights. I make my students read that one at the end of the semester to think about breaking out of the confines of genre.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay, so there's some preface for it in his authorship history there. Okay, so switching gears, I want to talk about like what you're doing now with your research. So you're an academic researcher. You're unaffiliated with any universities. You're just doing your own thing. But you're following like the research guidelines that you were trained on, that I was trained on. So you don't have an IRB necessarily, but you follow those protocols.
Yeah, well, we don't do IRB anyway in my field, so
Oh, you don't? Oh, well,
yeah,
not that you would have to, right? Yeah. No human testing with respect to
yeah.
that, but nevertheless, you're doing research, and you're looking to expand on that and really put it into more of a concentrated practice. What are your goals here?
Yeah, so right now I am working on writing journal articles. I've had, I guess, one peer-reviewed article come out, and I want to continue to kind of build on that research, speaking to both an interdisciplinary audience as well as to a literature studies audience. But obviously, when you write peer review articles, those are primarily for colleagues, academics.
Mm,
So something that I've been doing lately, because I think and people are really interested actually in what academics do, but it's not particularly accessible. So
that's
I
true.
started an Instagram account to kind of play around with that and make my research more accessible to people. I wanted to try to figure out how to speak to a general audience. Yeah,
What's your Instagram handle?
it is called the Metropolitanist, at the Metropolitanist.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen here so
Okay.
we can take a look at it as soon as my computer kicks over. So
Yeah,
you've chosen Instagram as your preferred
platform.
platform for distributing your research. And why didn't you look at Twitter or Facebook?
So I made a Twitter and an Instagram. Well, I don't really like Facebook. My audience there is very personal, I think, and it's just sort of like random people that I've collected over the years that I don't really see as being an audience necessarily. And also because Facebook is set up really, you need to be mutually friends with people, and there is a limit on how many friends you can have. So I think as a medium, it doesn't necessarily make sense for what I was trying to do. Twitter and Instagram, I got started on both at the same time, but I ended up, when I was a master's student, I was going to an academic conference actually, and I thought I better create these things so that I can live tweet from conferences, which I did not do, but it got me started. And I ended up using Instagram a lot more, I think, because just at the stage that I was at in my career, there's really no reason to have a strong presence on Twitter. And everybody I knew created Instagrams. So this was
Okay.
just our way of communicating with each other. And so for years, I had kind of experience just using that platform kind of casually. And then I was finding that I was spending more and more time on there, engaging with a lot of different genres of kind of Instagram, particularly fountain pen, fountain pens, Bookstagram,
Yeah.
and Notestagram were all really interesting to me. So I thought, well, I don't want to spend so much time consuming this. I'd like to start trying to figure out where my work fits into this and maybe create something. And I thought, urban literary studies has the potential to be such a visual field because cities are just an object of photographic representation so much. So I decided, this is it. I have a larger amount of space to write about what I want to write about, but it's not unlimited. So I can't spend too much time the way a blog post might sort of, I can spend hours on a blog post, which is terrible. And I don't have the time to do that.
Is most of that editing?
No, most of it's,
Okay.
I guess, because it's kind of like writing and editing at the same time, right? And 3 hours later, you're like, what have I done? I should have written a journal article. I should have been working on that. And instead I was looking up, how do I explain Erich Auerbach to a general audience? And so I find it's very similar to writing a journal article, except then, you're writing it a lot faster. You don't have a peer review process, but there's still a certain standard that has to be met, and it just gets out of control very quickly. So having a word limit was important to me. And so that's where I chose Instagram.
So your Instagram handle is at Metropolitanist?
The Metropolitanist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just chose an interesting profile to follow. There we go. All right.
Whoops.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. I'm gonna share this. Bear with me. Let's see here. All right. So we're looking at your Instagram at the Metropolitanist. And you've got some nicely crafted, composed images here. Are there any that kind of stick out to you that there's a good story behind, or just something that's, moved you or made an impression?
Well, so there are three kind of genres that I tend to write in on here, and you can see that I'm rotating them pretty regularly. So on the right, no, on the left-hand column is all urban imagery, and then kind of interspersed on the other two with notes and books. And so I try to draw an audience primarily from Bookstagram and Notestagram and then fountain pens. And then talk about literature from at the same time with like urban images. And let's see, if we go, let me look at mine here. One that I was particularly pleased with recently is this one that's of the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies.
Okay. I just saw that one.
Yeah, so I don't work on that at all, but I was at NEMLA recently, and I was looking around for different ways to represent academic conferencing to my audience so that I would have images to go along with writing about that. And then COVID came along and just completely disrupted my plans for recounting how the conference went. But basically what this image is trying to give people a visual representation of conference materials that's still cohesive with my overall look of my page, and then tell them a little bit about some of the, let's see, I think for this one I was talking about the publishing workshops that I was in. So I have a pretty large, unintentionally cultivated following of graduate students and aspiring graduate students. So I thought they'd probably be interested in hearing about how the publishing workshop went. And this was the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies was the example that the workshop runners at Intellect gave us to look at to see sort of what they do and have something to hold on to. So for the first time, I guess, as an Instagrammer, I actually walked up to someone and asked, can I have this? And they agreed. So that was, that's one image.
Cool. So I'll make that link available in the show notes. Just one last question before we go. What advice do you have for students, really, of any major discipline, or more specifically, you can handle it from few different ways. Those that want to become better writers and researchers, they're all graduating from a bachelor's program now. So, you know, when they enter the economy, depending on the state of it, after this is over, there might not be some jobs available, or they genuinely want to go to grad school. What advice do you have for folks that are interested in progressing their academic careers into master's and potentially PhD?
Mm. I mean, first, I think it's a really valuable experience, you know, regardless of if I end up finding one of those much desired tenure track positions. I don't think that
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people who I think regret having gone through the PhD, or I've met a lot of academics who say, you know, be careful, you don't want to get stuck on this career track.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say I don't regret it at all. I think it was a great, you know, 8-year run that I've had so far, thinking about ideas that were really interesting to me. And I think I'll be able to take that into any career. So I think approach it as like an opportunity to have some protected time to explore a subject that you're really interested in, and then be flexible in the way that you think about how you want to move forward in your career from there. Don't get trapped in that idea that, you know, well, now I have this degree, I have to find a job where that degree is a requirement. Which I find is a very common,
Right.
actually, mindset that people get. And as far as going to graduate school, I think in terms of the application process, really look for a program that seems well suited to what you're interested in studying. Like, I don't think I would have been happy, say, at an Ivy League trying to cram as much Latin or ancient Greek into my
Sure.
head as I possibly could
Yeah.
in a 5-year span. That wouldn't have been a good fit for me. So finding that good fit, and then, but alternatively, going to like a comparative literature program that was focused on film studies also wouldn't have been a great fit for me because I don't study film or really visual
Right.
mediums at all. So yeah, departments vary enormously from place to place. Like, be very picky about which ones you
Mm-hmm.
choose to apply to, and think of that as a choice that you're making. Um, and then from there, really think about how you want to frame yourself. It's when you propose a project and like a personal statement, it's not that you're going to be stuck with that project. I've changed my projects every time. I've
Right.
never done the project I told them I was going to do. But what a committee wants to see when they're picking their graduate students is whether you can imagine a cohesive project.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine that
Yeah.
project and propose it.
You know, that's such a great point, because so when I started my PhD, I went through the orientations in the first few classes, and they said, like, you don't have to settle on your dissertation topic anytime soon. Like, you're going to have like a good year to really figure that out, right? And then the following week, our assignment was write your dissertation topic. And I'm just like, I've been here a week. I don't even know. Like, I have ideas, but what, what, why? Yeah. So, you know, finding the right instructor, the right program, the right university, the right city, all of those things I feel are very, very important, especially when you want to go through the PhD track. Because
Mhm.
it is your life. Everything about it is your life, and you're really living it, and you're immersed and dedicated, and
And it's a financial sacrifice. I guess it's
it
another thing
is,
people need to be aware of. Is you will not be
unless,
compensated financially.
right, yeah, unless you get like a free ride or something, which is incredibly rare. It is a
Well, and
massive
even at that,
financial
usually
undertaking.
they keep you on a pretty like tight
Oh yeah.
financial margin. So it's like, I think when I was at Clemson, I mean, I had a fully funded PhD or master's degree, but we were getting paid like $14,000 a year, which you can make work in Clemson, South Carolina, but it's,
Sure.
you know, not not the thrill of anyone's life, I think, to have a bachelor's
Right.
degree and be working for that salary.
Oh no, of course, yeah. And so, you know, on that note, like, I'll use the basically work while you PhD. That's a model that I think is going to come out of the COVID crisis a bit more. in practice. Same with master's degrees. It's not like you have to quit school to do these things. Like now there's paths where you can make money and learn at the same time. And it's still just as demanding, and the rigor is nuts. But, you know, you can come out of that on the other side pretty successful.
And thinking about cultivating skills that you want to take into a future career is you're like finding those side jobs as well. Like for me, doing the Instagram was a good opportunity just to be able to add to my resume that I know how to like work with social media. So, you know, you have 5 years in a PhD program, take that time to just cultivate some daily practice that engages with the field you want to go into. So, and that could be, you know, the jobs that you pursue. But then again, you know, there are a lot of people who work as like bartenders while they're doing their degrees as well, just because it offers a lot of freedom. So.
Yeah, and the release from the stress maybe, because it's very physical and active. So we're going to go ahead and have to stop. But if students are interested in connecting with you, learning more about you and what you're doing with your research, how can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at the Metropolitanist, and then you can find my website at maisonmetropolitanist.com, which is its own interesting story about how that developed. And a marketing friend of mine took me through my paces to figure out what my kind of like angle or brand was going to be there. And I think we settled on something pretty cohesive. So that's where you can find me.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for chatting with us, and stay safe up there in New York City. And we'll check in with you soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, stay safe, everyone else too.
That's right. Stay safe out there. See ya.